It's only in recent memory that I've started to see the concept of something being middle of the road, or mid, as something which is considered to be bad. And, perhaps that tells us a lot about how the standards for media have gotten higher and higher as time goes on. Or perhaps it harkens to a fact of human emotion, which is that the things we love and hate are better than the things which are boring to us. I think any one of us can spend hours complaining about a show or story we don't like, but barely any of us would afford more than a few minutes talking about something which is boring. However, when it comes to rating and reviews, it is my personal philosophy that things which should get a rating of a 1 or a 2 out of 10 are not the things which are so absolutely terrible that I love to hate them, but instead the ones that are terrible in a sense that watching paint dry in a rainstorm would be an infinitely more stimulating use of my time and attention. But recently we have had general audiences weaponize the term mid in order to mean something that is bad or overrated. The overwhelming sentiment that something is not worth watching, not because it angers us, but because it is boring. But by the same token, I also think that there are plenty of people out there who use the term mid to dismiss something that other people enjoy for which they themselves do not. Cult classics, mainstream music, or culture-defining stories will inevitably be called mid simply because the critic does not see what all the fuss is about. The most recent example of this that I can think of is Frieren. It's a masterclass in fantasy storytelling, which dethroned Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood as the most highly rated anime of all time on my anime list. However, due to the very niche nature of Frieren's storytelling, we got plenty of people claiming that the show was boring and overrated, telling fans of the show that they only like it because sometimes it has moments of beautiful animation, but that neither the characters, the magic system, nor the plot was very interesting. But in my opinion, Frieren is deserving of its #1 spot. When I watched Frieren, I felt as if I was watching something more than just another season of fantasy anime. There was something which resonated deep inside of me that I almost cannot describe. Frieren showed me a fantasy world which I had forgotten existed, and made me feel the same sense of wonder that I did when I first picked up the fantasy genre through RPGs like Dragon Quest, Skyrim, and Dark Souls. Or movies like Sword in the Stone, Spirited Away, and Star Wars. Yes, Star Wars is more fantasy than it is sci-fi. Fuck you, fight me. And even though I did not watch nor read Tolkien's stories until later on in life, those stories still had an effect on worlds which did have a profound effect on my love for the fantasy genre. Frieren happened to be the most recent story which made me feel a type of way that I had forgotten I could feel, which is funny because the last time I remember feeling the way I do about Frieren was when I played Elden Ring for the first time without any walkthroughs or spoilers. But the thing that Elden Ring and Frieren share in common is that they were both incredibly well-made experiences which grew popular beyond their core audiences. And in both of them, we have people unfairly calling them mid for one stupid reason or another. In my opinion, I think people should stop confusing something which is boring, middle of the road, or below average for something which is well-made, but which does not personally resonate with us. The phrase people will usually use to sum up this type of feeling is, "I can see why people like this, but it's not for me personally." And that's a fair statement to make, but to anyone who has made that statement in public before, you know the reaction people tend to have about that sentiment. It's sort of like that time in Family Guy where Peter Griffin admits that he did not care for The Godfather. A lot of time, people might try to convince you that it is good, or misinterpret your comment to mean that you actually hate what you've watched because it is bad. In reality, a phrase like that means exactly what it says. I did not like this thing, but I can still acknowledge that it was well made. And that's not a phrase meant to soften the blow either. If I say that about something, it's never about anything objective. It's me acknowledging that despite the objective merits of something, the way I feel is that I do not like what I've seen. Because as much as we discuss and hammer home the objective aspects of a work of art, they are still beholden to our thoughts, beliefs, and opinions. They are still subjectively enjoyed despite being objectively created well. My own personal example of this is Neon Genesis Evangelion. For years, I had heard that it was a cult classic, a show which subverted and redefined the genre of mecha anime, that its story was riveting and the show itself was utterly groundbreaking for its time. And for people who watched and enjoyed its story, I can definitely see why. It was well produced, there's a lot to like about Eva, but for me, I just couldn't help but be bored with the entire show. The first few episodes alone nearly put me to sleep, and the fights we see are rarely ever entertaining or long-lasting. Much of the show revolves around the characters who pilot the mechs. But I find the characters somewhat insufferable. I know they're supposed to be flawed, and I know those flaws are the appeal of the character. However, they don't appeal to me, nor does the story and the general vibes of said story appeal to me either. Would I call Eva mid? Yeah, but only to get under Harley TBS's skin.
Fuck you! You fucking
Shut up! Anyways, how I feel about Eva is simple. I don't care, but I see why people do, and that's fine. Now, on the other hand, I can also acknowledge shows which make me angry that they are so highly rated and yet so unbelievably bad. Bakemonogatari is a show that makes the processor fan in my brain kick on and then combust into flames. I get overstimulated by the flashing colors, subliminal messaging, and generally batshit insane dialogue between the characters. On top of that, the main protagonist is both an insufferable pussy along with being an unapologetic fucking PDF file. There is no sense of plot nor direction for the story, and everything just seems completely out of place and nonsensical. The only thing I can see, which is stellar, are the well-animated titty physics and fight scenes. But from the story to the cinematography to the dialogue and characters, everything about Bakemonogatari makes me want to peel my fucking eyeballs off one layer at a time until I've successfully scooped out the mush that my brain has been reduced to just for having watched it. But by the same token, I can also acknowledge that Bakemonogatari is not mid, it's just fucking bad, and I love to hate it. The only people I can think of who would enjoy things like this are young teenagers who love tits, keys being jiggled in their face, and fully grown adults who belong on Kendrick Lamar's next diss track. And no, symbolism is not a good substitute for storytelling. You're just pretentious. Click this video to find out why. But I think here, about 1,000 words into my script, is where I get into the core of why I'm making this video in the first place. And that's to say, not everything needs to be peak. Sometimes it can just be mid, and that's okay. I think there is a general sense in the anime community especially, which has made me long for the good old days like some sort of old man who forgot to take his meds. In an age where people are getting faster at figuring out what they will or won't enjoy when it comes to entertainment, there are some stories which we do not know we will like until we sit down and give them a fair shot. Unfortunately, due to the sheer volume of anime coming out, the ease of access to good shows through some Yarhar Shiver Me Tars routes, and the massive amount of anime review channels we can trust the opinions of, there is very little space for finding things for ourselves. It used to be that anime dubs and subs were incredibly difficult to come by, and I'm not here to say that I am old enough to remember those days, just that I'm old enough to remember the days when YouTube had massive amounts of re-uploaded old anime shows with those exact same subs, and almost none of them were actually very good. What I did do during my middle school and high school days was watch an enormous amount of bog standard and mid anime. Ones which were so unbelievably mid and so unbelievably boring and forgettable that I have actually forgotten the majority of the ones that I watched back then. There is a harem anime-sized hole in my memory, and it is one which I do not really care to fill. Those memories are probably gone for a good reason. But I think if I were to act as if those below average shows were somehow indicative of a trend or a moral failing on the part of a studio or writer, I think that's where I would be in the wrong. Because a lot of anime fans seem to do that these days. If something comes out and it's not up to their standards, or it's a genre and a type of story which they just don't like, suddenly it's everywhere, and it's a problem of a declining industry and a declining quality of writing, with almost zero information or actual data to back it up. I think for me, if I had never wasted my time watching those below average shows, I never would have come to truly appreciate the good shows. If I had never experienced how bad things could be, I think my expectations of greatness would be unreasonable. Not every show needs to have incredible animation to tell a good story, and some shows can have simple stories with some stellar fight scenes which make it a must-watch. I think the higher we set our expectation as viewers, the further we plummet when those expectations are not met. Mushoku Tensei is a great example of this. Many people will rightfully be turned off by its main protagonist's interests. But for the people who manage to push past the weird bits, like a kid kicking corn out of their mashed potatoes, we are able to see an incredibly well-realized fantasy setting with great characters and an even greater narrative. The first season of Mushoku is about as perfect of an adaptation as anyone could ever hope for. The art direction, the music, the voice acting, and the animation are all perfect, and much of the show elevates the source material far beyond expectation. And then the second season is a little less than perfect, even though it is still pretty good. For those who have not noticed any drop in quality between the show's first and second seasons, you're probably a normal human being. Some people, however, have an eye for animation and detail, and will often browse threads of other people who compare and hyperanalyze every single frame of an animation. This usually happens to a show when there is a major change in the staff. If something comes out as something less than perfect in this instance, there is a decent-sized group of people who will lament how the show has fallen off, despite the fall-off being little more than a shallow drop in quality. I think for the people who have had issues with the animation of Mushoku Tensei's second season, they are likely at the mercy of their own unrealistic expectations. The second season is fine. In fact, it's far above average as far as direction and production value goes. Maybe it is because I grew up in the times when animation was transitioning from traditional cell animation to digital animation, but even if someone's eye is a little off in one area, or the head is slightly too thin in another frame, I don't find myself enjoying the show any less. There are certain details which will only be noticed if you are deeply into the animation aspect of anime, and you are actively looking for those flaws yourself. For me personally though, as a fan of Mushoku Tensei, for the last 7 or 8 years, I have never had any false expectations, nor was I saddened by the slight dip in quality from Season 1 to Season 2. But I think the most important thing about watching shows which are middle of the road, or shows which fall just short of being peak, is the perspective that they give us. They contextualize the difficulty of achieving a truly great show, and watching shows which are not perfect help us appreciate the ones which are all the more. It's like watching a plane flying through the sky. With nothing around it to compare it to, all we can perceive is the plane moving at a slow and peaceful pace. But if the plane was right next to us, or we were inside the plane narrowly avoiding mountains at high speeds, we would certainly have a completely different perspective for how fast the plane actually moves, and how marvelous it is that it's even in the air to begin with. By the same token, I also don't believe going out of our way to watch bad movies and shows that you hate is somehow going to make you more cultured. If anything, I think it's just going to make you a more bitter person overall. I think it's healthier to just admit to ourselves that sometimes we're only watching something because we love to hate it. Astoria! I also don't think consuming poorly written stories is somehow going to make us better writers either. Sure, we can find new lessons in everything, But knowing what not to do doesn't exactly have anything to do with knowing what we should do. Yes, I have advised taking media which you disliked and using it as inspiration to make something of your own in previous videos, but that advice is more about finding the good things in something you otherwise dislike. Sometimes a story can have a good idea, but lack the execution to make that idea work. Part of being a writer is learning to spot those things and reuse those ideas for your own means. And watching shows which are mediocre might also help us find the things we did not know we would enjoy. Stories which everyone else disliked, but which we ourselves have resonated strongly with for one reason or another. Skinnamarink is an analog horror movie which is going to make you feel one of two ways. Either bored out of your mind or racked with fear. For me, it's the first horror movie in a long time which actually genuinely frightened me when I watched it. The strange purgatory the movie is set in, the long pausing shots with unsettling white noise, the faint silhouettes hiding just outside our vision, the imperfect film grain tricking my eyes into thinking something is in the frame when it isn't. To some, Skinnamarink is not a scary movie because it simply doesn't offer us anything to be scared of. There is no terrible monster or immediate danger. In fact, there's not even much of a plot to it, just a bunch of liminal spaces, paranormal activity, and a distorted sense of nostalgia. But for me, it reminds me of when I was a kid, watching the glow of the TV bouncing off the white walls of my home, of the nights where I would crawl out of my crib to explore a dark and empty house, only to scurry back in bed when I became too frightened of what might be lurking in the dark. It reminds me of strange dreams I've had where exits disappear and I am with a person who feels familiar in the moment, but who is a complete stranger when I remember the dream in my waking hours. Skinnamarink is the feeling of a memory brought back as I eat food that I have not eaten in decades. It draws upon a deeply nostalgic part of my own psyche and twists it into something unsettling. That's why I think I liked the movie so much, but for those who lack that experience, the movie is not going to be very scary to them. Many might argue it's boring, mid, and pretentious, and in fact, if you have ever looked at the reviews for the movie Skinnamarink, you will see that it sits at about a 29%, which is probably one of the lowest ratings I've ever seen for a movie, even if it's a horror movie. I never would have experienced something which resonated with me had I not just watched Skinnamarink on a whim. If I had looked at review scores first, or had someone tell me about how terrible it was, I don't think I would have ever given the movie a chance. I think it's the same thing with any story we consume. I think bad movies have every right to exist, and a world without them is kind of just a world which is bland and boring. Sometimes a niche story is not going to resonate with the majority of people, but the people it does resonate with are the ones which that story can serve better than anything else. There is a part of me that wonders if all the review scores, collective agreement, awards, and popularity we judge stories by are all worthless when it comes to finding the things we truly enjoy. Yes, it does feel good to find a great story before it gets popular. It feels good to have our emotions validated by a show's popularity. It feels bad to hear someone call our favorite show mid or terrible. And yes, review scores are useful because we only have a limited amount of time and money to consume media with, but sometimes I cannot help feeling that we've lost something along the way, that there are things which fall through the cracks of our current system, lost media which we may never enjoy because it's been drowned out by all the chatter and public discussion. I think that's the appeal to finding hidden gems, or making retrospectives on things which used to be critically panned. There's something about lost media and its discovery which tends to tickle my brain from time to time. When someone talks about something I don't exactly understand, but they talk about it with such a passion that I am invested anyway. That's something which doesn't get enough appreciation, I think. Bottom line, next time you see a show you really want to watch, but it has a bad review score, give it a watch anyways. Who knows, you might find something to make a memory of. or at the very least, it will give you a newfound appreciation for the things that you do enjoy. Thanks for watching, and if you like this video, do feel free to subscribe. I've also got memberships, so join that as well. And if you don't want to do that, like and comment or something. But yeah, this has been this video, so have a good one. See ya!